During the Yom Kippur War, the US and Soviet Union surged naval and air forces into the Mediterranean. It was the most tense time since the Cuban Missile Crisis and brought the superpowers to the brink of war. In this video, I'll take a look at the composition of the US and Soviet air power deployed to the region. I've also created two scenarios for a US Navy air campaign in the Middle East in October 1973 to give an insight into the makeup and capabilities of an early 1970s US carrier battle group. Two carrier groups were in the Mediterranean when war broke out on October 6th. These were centered around the USS Independence in Athens and the Franklin D. Roosevelt, the battle group for which was distributed between several Spanish ports. The helicopter carrier Guadalcanal was also forward deployed as part of Task Force 61. 3,000 Marines were aboard these ships, but no Harriers yet, sadly. When war broke out, TF-61 moved to Suda Bay and weighed anchor to wait and see what unfolded. Independence, the easternmost carrier, was the fourth and final ship in the Forrestal class. She had been commissioned in 1959, and although three classes of US carrier had already succeeded the Forrestals, Independence remained one of the most powerful warships in the world. These were the days of large carrier air wings, so in October 1973, Carrier Air Wing 7 consisted of 8 fixed-wing squadrons and 1 rotary. 2 F-4J Phantom squadrons provided air cover for the group. These were VF-33 Tarsiers and VF-122 Diamondbacks. The Tarsiers had been an F-8 Crusader squadron until 1964, when they moved on to the F-4B. They received their F-4Js in 1967. The Diamondbacks flew the Skyray until 1961 and then moved on to the Phantom. F-4J, alongside the Air Force F-4E, was the best air-to-air fighter in the world in 1973. The slatted wing E model was more maneuverable, but a little bit slower. The J's major advantage was the AWG-10 pulse Doppler radar, which added look-down, shoot-down capability to the Phantom for the first time. As well as added maneuverability, the E also had the Vulcan cannon in the nose. They're different flavors of a brilliant basic product. The Navy crews would likely, and possibly rightly, claim to be the best trained and best prepared air crews in the world. The aviators they were supporting in Israel would reasonably suggest that practical experience beat out even the exceptional school at Top Gun. VA-12 Clinchers and VA-66 Waldos, both flying the A7E Crusader, and VA-65, the Tigers, flying the A6 Intruder, form the strike component of the air wing. If the Marines were called to go ashore, then it would be these squadrons that would be the first in to support them. The other 3 fixed-wing squadrons were smaller units of more specialized aircraft. RVAH-14 was an interesting, if short-lived squadron. It was established as a heavy reconnaissance and attack squadron, served between 1968 and 1974, and flew the RA-5C Vigilante. The Vigilante had originally come aboard ships as a long-range nuclear bomber, but over time had shifted into a mixed role that included strategic reconnaissance. For the time, it was an absolute beast of a plane, weighing 28 tons at takeoff weight and capable of Mach 2. Although the Vigilante superseded the Douglas Sky Warrior in the nuclear strike role, the older aircraft continued to serve. VAQ-130, the Zappers, flew the EKA-3B, which had a dual role as a tanker and electronic countermeasures aircraft. The latter capability would have been essential in the SAM-rich environment that had blunted the IDAF-AF. Finally, VAW-122 Hummer Gators provided airborne warning and control from their E-2B Hawkeyes, and HS-5, the Night Dippers flying the Sea King, were always around to harass Soviet submarines and on hand in case any pilots ended up in the water. Carrier Air Wing 7 was one of the best equipped in the Navy, which was just as well as it was on the front line of an increasingly tense situation between the superpowers and an increasingly desperate one for Israel. 500 miles to the west, the smaller Midway-class carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt played host to Air Wing 6. Its squadrons operated older aircraft across the board. VF-41 Black Aces and VF-84 Jolly Rogers both flew the original F-4B Phantom in the air defense role. VA-15 Valiants and VA-87 Golden Warriors both flew the A7B Corsair II. VA-176 Thunderbolts operated a mix of A6A and A6C model Intruders. I believe that the Intruder squadrons would typically deploy with 4 KA-6D tankers as well, but I haven't been able to confirm that they were aboard in October 1973. In the recon role, a detachment of VFP-63 flying the RF-8G Crusader was apparently due to be on board the FDR, but I can't find any record of them actually being there either. Airborne early warning was provided by VAW-121 Bluetails. These were flying the older, smaller, and less capable E-1B Tracer rather than the Hawkeye. HC-2 Fleet Angels and their Sea Kings completed the air wing. In total, the two carriers closest to the action could thus muster about 48 Phantoms, 48 Corsairs, 24 Intruders, 6 to 10 tankers, 8 airborne early warning aircraft, and a small collection of recon and electronic warfare planes. If you compare that concentration to the Arab or Israeli air forces, you can see that this force would be a real game changer in the event of an escalation in the conflict. As it became clear that Israel was under severe pressure and was suffering unsustainable attrition, the US began Operation Nickelgrass. On the 14th of October 1973, 6th Fleet fighters started flying combat air patrols to cover the airlift and provide a deck for replacement A4 Skyhawks to land on. Although it was unlikely that Egypt or Syria would deliberately target the Galaxies as they lumbered over the sea, accidents happen. Fighter jets tend to be good insurance. Washington also ordered the Independence and Roosevelt battle groups to deploy their escorts in a loose east-to-west line across the Mediterranean in order to help the Galaxy and Starlifter transports to navigate. There was no GPS in 1973, of course. At this stage, with the Israeli counterattacks having largely failed, there was the chance that the US would have to directly intervene to prevent Israel being overrun. In that eventuality, there was a high chance that Israel would use one of its nuclear warheads. Even a demonstration detonation would risk drawing the Soviets into things and escalate tensions between the superpowers. If the Egyptians had decided to push out from their bridgehead in the Canal Zone into the Sinai, could the two carrier air wings have stopped them? The mission in this scenario would be to halt the forward momentum of the Egyptian mechanized divisions by destroying a preponderance of their vehicles and damaging their logistics chain. Accomplishing these objectives would probably mean dropping the pontoon bridges over the Suez Canal. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that the Soviets wouldn't have intervened as long as no US troops were on the ground. That frees the 6th Fleet air wings from having to defend the carriers from anything more than a suicidal bombing attack by Egyptian Su-7s and 17s, or maybe the odd Kelt missile fired by Tu-16s. The carriers' escorts and a small cap should have been able to handle those. That would free the bulk of the Phantom squadrons to wrest air superiority from the EAF. Even before we get to the small matter of outfighting them, there is the complexity of the fact that there are 3 distinct air forces already taking part in the war, as well as a range of Arab countries which have loaned planes to the cause. Confusingly, those forces include Libyan Mirage 5s, which are essentially indistinguishable from Israeli Neshas. Deconflicting the airspace over the region would be a major problem. As far as I'm aware, there had been no significant exercises between the US Navy and the IDF-AF in the run-up to the war. I think I'm right in saying that some Israeli aviators had attended Top Gun, but that's about it. The US Navy would have been keen to avoid a similar situation to Vietnam, in which rules of engagement made gaining air superiority almost impossible. Whether Washington would have been amenable to that is another matter. But let's imagine that the desk jockeys and politicians were going to be helpful for once. In my opinion, the most likely scenario in the event of a US intervention would have been to agree that no Israeli aircraft would operate over the Sinai or in Egypt proper. That would free the IDF-AF to pound the Syrians into submission and mean that the Navy could assume anything in the Sinai area was hostile. A notable challenge with that approach is that it would make close air support very hard to accomplish. Beyond the fact that they'd never practiced, the chances are that simple things like radio frequencies would be difficult to coordinate. And although English was widely spoken in Israel, it wasn't the default language of the IDF. Even so, given all of the other problems facing Israel, this one would be worth the exchange rate. Establishing air superiority under those conditions requires two things. The 4 Phantom squadrons, supported by the AEW crews, would need to defeat the EAF led by its MiG-21 MF squadrons. This may have been more straightforward than beating the VPAF in Vietnam. Egyptian pilots were generally better trained than their Vietnamese counterparts, but they lacked effective GCI. The flatter terrain and clearer skies made it harder to launch the kind of aerial ambushes that characterize MiG-21 operations in Southeast Asia. The EAF had also been fighting hard for over a week. There had been attrition and doubtless some pilots' nerves were beginning to fray. Of course, Israeli aviators were also well aware of the capabilities of the MiG-21. They were also well trained, experienced, and highly skilled. They had the F-4E Phantoms, and if you like guns more than radars, then you might think that the E was a better air-to-air fighter than the J. So how would the Navy fare? Well, there is a difference between the pilots. The Israeli Phantom community were very much expected to be a strike as well as an air superiority force. Only the Mirage 3 was regarded as a pure dogfighter. The US Navy's F-4 squadrons, on the other hand, had evolved to replace the Crusader as a pure interceptor and air dominance group. With the pure attack Corsair and Intruder, there wasn't so much need to load Navy Phantoms with bombs, although of course they did practice it. Top Gun was gaining momentum and the alt report was still reverberating. Squadrons like VF-41 now essentially had one job: killing MiGs. As well as the AWG-10 and AIM-7F Sparrow combination in the J model, they were aided in this with their access to the AIM-9G Sidewinder. So they had the best air-to-air missile in the world and the best air-to-air fighter in the world, and the training to employ both effectively. On the other hand, the Egyptians had the excellent MiG-21 MF, but unfortunately for them, only the obsolete K-13 ATOL. They did have an internal gun, but there was little chance the US Navy would give them the chance to use it. They had a fraction of the experience of their opponent and no AEW to help them. I'm not saying that this would have been a turkey shoot, but it's hard to imagine things going well for the EAF in the Sinai. They would likely have been held back to protect Cairo and its surroundings. The Egyptians, and to a lesser extent the Syrians, knew this, of course. Having failed to gain air superiority by failing to catch the IDF-AF on the ground on the 6th, they focused on using their SAMs and Shilkas to create a stalemate that denied air superiority to both sides. That worked against the IDF-AF. In fact, alongside the Saga anti-tank missiles, it was the cause of the dire situation that Israel found itself in on the 14th. In our scenario, it's the cause of the US intervention. The US Navy was, however, better equipped than the IDF-AF to operate and to win in a SAM environment. Although the SA-6 Gainful was a rude surprise to both the IDF and the US, Navy electronic warfare squadrons and iron hand capabilities were significantly stronger than those available to Israel. In this scenario, the Egyptian army is also on the road rather than defending a fixed position. SAM batteries of course move as a matter of course to make them harder to target, however supporting a moving army is a different ballgame. On the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal were 148 battalions of SA-2, SA-3 and SA-6 SAMs. Although the SA-6 gets all of the historical press, there were actually only 10 battalions of these, each consisting of 4 3-round transporter erector launchers. And the SA-6s were the only SAM systems really able to closely follow the advancing Egyptian army. Each army division also had around 4 ZSU-57-2s, a dual 57mm automatic cannon turret mounted on a T-54 tank chassis, and 4 ZSU-23-4 Shilkers, which require no introduction. Numerous Strela manpads were also present. So how might the two carrier air wings have tackled these threats? The curious EKA-3B would have played an essential role. Its S-band Alt-27 jamming system was capable of degrading the performance of all of the Soviet-built systems in the region except the SA-6. Its detection and analysis gear could detect the SA-6 search radar and analyze its position, but not impede it. The ALQ-92 comms jammer that it also carried would have been effective at jamming Egyptian and Syrian fighter control radios in the VHF band, further increasing the ability of Navy fighters to dominate the battlespace by cutting off the MiGs from their GCI. Inability to jam the SA-6 radars might seem like a major issue. Although far from ideal, it wasn't that much of a problem in reality. Egypt only had 10 SA-6 systems and had lost a couple of them in the early days of the war. Each system only had one search radar. As soon as the batteries moved out away from the cover of the overlapping fixed installations west of the canal, their coverage would instantly fall off. Their radars couldn't radiate all the time because the systems were on the move, and they wouldn't want to anyway because they'd be too easy a target. Finally, with a range of only about 40 miles, there'd be lots of dead spots even if they were powered on all of the time. Israeli aviators flying against those sites only had the AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile, which it turns out couldn't actually home on the SA-6 radar. The Shrike also had limited range even when modified, and if the radiating site went off air, the Shrike couldn't remember where it was and would be useless. The Navy's A6s did carry Shrike, but they could also carry the AGM-78 Standard Arm. This had a range beyond the detection range of the SA-6, and it could remember where the site was if it stopped radiating. If the Navy Phantom crews could win air superiority over the MiGs, then there was also the option of flying high, beyond the 46,000 feet ceiling of the Cub's missiles. This wasn't possible for Israeli aviators near the canal zone, as Egyptian heavy SA-2s were effective at those altitudes. Once the SAMs were dealt with, the highly accurate A7 Corsair could wreak havoc from altitudes outside the range of mobile gun systems. Intruders may also have been deployed in night attacks on targets around Cairo to hit logistics and air bases. Those kinds of attacks were generally out of the capability of the IDF-AF, as its Phantoms had only limited night attack capabilities, they were very committed during the daylight hours, and the Israelis were actually shorter on pilots than they were on airframes. Hitting west of the canal too hard would, however, have risked escalation, as it's unlikely the Soviets would have accepted it. In saying all of this, I don't want to give the impression that it would have been easy. The risks were very significant, but nothing like going up north in Vietnam. Fundamentally, the two US carriers were host to the most advanced aircraft in the region. Their F-4Js were at least as good as the Israeli Kurnas. The A7 was superior to the A4, it was its successor after all. The A6's night interdiction capabilities were not present at all in the theatre, likewise no one else had any airborne early warning aircraft. The IDAF had substantial ECM capabilities, although for the most part they were based on slightly older technology. It was also mounted on platforms that couldn't really get very close to the front lines. The two EC-130 Hercules in their inventory were large, slow, and couldn't operate at high altitudes. Modified S-65 helicopters were restricted in their employment in a high-threat environment. The issue for the two Navy carriers in halting an Egyptian advance would have been in sortie production. Sortie production is influenced by many factors, but primarily, distance from the carrier to the target is obviously important, as the longer the plane stays in the air, the less time there is to refuel and rearm it. The two carriers would have likely needed to move somewhere between Crete and Israel to reduce the single-leg distance to 150 or 200 miles. If necessary, then they could have gone closer. The Israeli Navy had effectively eliminated the Arab navies by this point in the war. The layout of the carrier is also a major factor. The Forrestalls had issues with the placement of their aircraft elevators that made using the hangar and magazines at full capacity an intricate dance requiring exact planning. The midways were simply too small to allow for rapid management of aircraft. They also had more limited fuel bunkers and magazine depth. And, of course, pilots need a rest. If you look at the super surge exercises that the Navy conducted in the 80s and 90s, the carriers were staffed with 25% more pilots than typical. The 6th Fleet carriers didn't have any extra pilots aboard, so they couldn't super surge like this. Independence was therefore likely capable of surging to 2 sorties per aircraft per day, although its natural rate was more like 1 per day. Roosevelt, which was smaller and only had 3 catapults, was unlikely to get to 2 at the best of times. Even so, they would have been capable of generating between 150 and 200 sorties a day on a sustained basis. The amount of damage they would have caused would have really made the Egyptian political leadership think twice about continuing offensive operations past the Sinai. All of this is assumed that there would have been no Soviet intervention. That is not a given in this scenario, and it was not a given in 1973. The Egyptian and Syrian plan to attack Israel was only revealed to the Kremlin on October 4, 1973. Although Brezhnev did little if anything to dissuade Sadat, he did gain agreement to evacuate Soviet civilians in advance of the war starting. The Soviet Mediterranean Fleet, known as the 5th Escadra, surged its forces to the Egyptian and Syrian coast to cover that evacuation. At this early stage, the squadron could muster 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 5 frigates. 11 submarines were also in support, about half of which were carrying anti-ship cruise missiles. Another destroyer and 4 more submarines entered the Mediterranean on the following day. Moscow began sending equipment and supplies to Syria and Egypt on the 9th of October. Some Egyptian sources deny that they ever received anything after the war began, but that doesn't tally with the Soviet records. Soviet and Warsaw Pact merchant ships and Soviet amphibious warfare vessels conducted the sea lift. They were accompanied by giant AN-22 transports, which were granted permission to fly over Turkey, a NATO member, in protest of US support for Israel. The Soviet Navy covered this effort as well, albeit they had only very limited ability to protect the air bridge. Armed Soviet Air Force flights into the Mediterranean were effectively blocked by Greece and Turkey, both NATO members. The nearest Soviet fighters to the Mediterranean were in Bulgaria. These bases were home to aging MiG-19 fighters, which lacked the range to reach far out to sea and the capabilities to challenge the Phantoms for air superiority. They would, however, have made an interesting fight with Greek F-102s and F-5s. As it happens, the Mediterranean was the first theatre in which the Soviets deployed any notable naval aviation assets. As a counter to Polaris submarine deployments in the early 1960s, they had commissioned the cruiser Moskva. Although unambiguously a helicopter carrier, the Soviets referred to it as a large anti-submarine cruiser in order to enable it to pass through the Bosphorus. The Moskva was, however, never intended to offset US naval air superiority. It carried 18 Ka-25 helicopters, which would have been easy pickings for US Navy fighters. Moskva was also a fairly dreadful carrier, with poor seakeeping and cramped conditions making it hard to operate from. Carrier equipped or not, a 1973 naval clash in the Mediterranean between the US and Soviets may seem far-fetched. The Mediterranean was, after all, in effect a NATO lake. The US was able to use large bases at Rota in Spain, La Maddalena and Naples in Italy, and Suda Bay in Crete. The Soviets had no permanent bases, as leasing them would look too much like imperialism, the yoke of which the Soviets were supposed to be helping their Arab comrades throw off. Instead, the Soviet Navy relied on 12 pre-positioned floating docks, anchored in international waters. The main facilities were located off the Greek island of Kythera and in the Gulf of Sidra. Soviet ships had only very rudimentary underway replenishment capabilities, so they generally had to return to those docks to refuel and, if necessary, rearm. Lacking any shipyards, the only way the Soviets could reinforce was through the Dardanelles. This was not, however, an absolute barrier to their activities, as the Soviets were also able to exploit the tensions between Turkey, who controlled access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and its NATO allies. The Soviet order of battle in October 1973 was therefore much stronger than you might expect. Even so, its commander, Admiral Yevgeny Volubiev, didn't expect to last long in the event of a full-scale war. US air superiority meant that a doctrine of first strike was of primary importance. The Soviets called this the Battle of the First Salvo. In 1973, Volubiev set out his thoughts on the subject of anti-carrier warfare in a briefing to his officers. He said ship attack groups need to use all weaponry for assaults on aerial attack groups. Missiles, artillery, torpedoes, jet-powered rockets, the whole lot. Since it is unlikely anything will remain afloat after an airstrike, we are kamikazes. At this stage in the Cold War, Russian coordination between strike groups at sea was poor. Their ability to coordinate with long-range aviation assets or with submarines was close to zero. Mid-course guidance of anti-ship missiles was essential at the time, as these platforms would just launch their missiles into a box in which they hoped the carrier could be found. A close tail was therefore required. So as the sea and air bridges began, the Kinder-class cruiser Grozny and the Kashin-class destroyers Krasny Kavkaz, Porovny, and Skrony began to trail the Independence. Murmansk, a Sverdlov-class cruiser, and a destroyer followed the Roosevelt. A pair of Echo-class SSGNs, a Julia SSG, and a November SSN were also in the area around Crete. The signal was clear. If the US tried to interfere with the resupply effort, then the Soviets would meet the attempt with force. The US Navy, for its part, was increasingly frustrated with the restrictions placed on it from Washington. More escorts were dispatched from 6th Fleet to cover the carriers, but the signal the White House wanted to send was to Egypt and Syria, so they kept the carriers in a small area around Crete that made them predictable and easy for the Soviets to cover. The Sverdlov-class cruiser Admiral Ushkov and 2 more anti-aircraft destroyers arrived at Crete on the 10th. It started to trail the Guadalcanal as well. Things escalated further on the 11th when the Israeli Navy's missile boats attacked the harbour at Tartus. The Soviet merchant ship Ilya Mechnikov was moored there, having been one of the last ships to bring supplies to Syria when the war started. It was hit and sank within the harbour limits. The Soviets refused to accept Israel's apology for this and moved 2 destroyers close to the Syrian coast. The US responded by ordering the John F. Kennedy battle group to leave Scotland and transit into the Mediterranean. Then, on the 16th, several Soviet minor combatants, a minesweeper and a landing ship, fired at Israeli jets to drive them off. The situation was very tense and developing at a more rapid pace at sea than the commanders-in-chief in Moscow and Washington could respond to. On one side, the Soviets were wary of Israeli attacks on their ships, but also wanted to avoid accidentally engaging a US aircraft. On the other side, the US Navy needed to keep its carriers safe, but restricted in operational area and now stripped of escorts, this was an increasingly challenging task. Independence was now accompanied only by the 6th Fleet's flagship, Little Rock, the powerful SAM-equipped destroyer Belknap, and 2 destroyers with SAMs, the Kuntz and the Samson. Roosevelt's escort was based around the small Lee-class cruiser Harry E. Yarnell and 3 destroyers. The chances of a misunderstanding were significant. The US protested that Soviet ships had their missile launchers loaded and pointed at the US carriers. The Soviets agreed to stop doing this, but US destroyers shadowing the Soviet ships were given orders to shoot at the missile launchers if it looked like they were preparing to fire. But things really got worse on the 24th. By this stage, it was obvious that the Israelis had won. A second ceasefire had failed to hold. Port Said and Cairo itself were now at risk. At Sadat's pleading, Brezhnev sent a message to Nixon. He told the president that Israel was violating the UN resolution governing the ceasefire. He proposed a joint US and Soviet peacekeeping force to man the ceasefire lines. If Nixon rejected the proposal, then the Soviet Union would consider acting unilaterally. On the day that the note was received, a powerful Soviet naval force headed towards Port Said, centered around their cruiser Admiral Ushakov. It escorted 3 landing ships full of Soviet Marines. The CIA briefed Nixon that it believed that one of the Soviet ships heading to Egypt was carrying nuclear weapons that could be employed on the EAF's Sioux fitters. 7 divisions of Soviet airborne troops were also placed on alert. The practicalities of delivering those 50,000 soldiers to the region aren't clear, but the threat was there. The AN-22 transports suspended their flights in preparation for an order to transport them. US forces moved to DEFCON 3, Roundhouse. The tactical commanders were now in a very challenging situation. Both sides knew that they had to strike first to prevent taking severe damage. At DEFCON 3, the US Admiral's objective was to successfully launch 6 nuclear-armed intruders from the FDR and 8 from the Independence at 15 minutes' notice. Oddly, the vigilantes on Independence don't appear to have been tasked with nuclear strike in this instance, despite that being their only attack role. Their targets remain classified, but testimony from flight crews on the ships make it clear that nuclear delivery was the primary mission. Once that was done, they then needed to survive the inevitable Soviet attack. Striking first if war was inevitable was obviously preferable. Independence had Little Rock and Belknap in close attendance. The former, a Galveston-class guided missile cruiser, had once been a gun-armed light cruiser and retained 1 triple 6-inch gun turret. Its long-range Talos SAMs could also be used in a surface-to-surface capacity. Little Rock was thus the most powerful surface warship on either side. Trailing Independence, the Soviet cruiser Grozny had 8 SSN-3 Shadok launchers, massive 5-ton carrier-killing missiles carrying a 1-ton warhead, or, ominously, a 300-kiloton nuclear warhead. The weapons were carried in 2 quadruple launchers fore and aft. To fire them, the ship needed to turn broadside so that the exhaust would be vented over the side. Given the close proximity of the 2 sides, the US would therefore have had some warning of a launch. The missiles were radar-directed, so emissions would have given the Soviets away. My understanding of Soviet tactical doctrine is that if the intention was to strike, Grozny and one of the destroyers would have stood off 15 or 20 miles, leaving the other destroyer in close to provide mid-course guidance. Their intention was to reduce the ability of the carrier's escorts to respond by being able to launch without radiating. Logically, the US response to this would have been to run away as fast as possible. Independence was at least 5 knots faster than Grozny, and possibly as much as 10 knots. If the Soviets managed to get off a salvo, then the Talos and smaller Terrier missiles on the US escorts may have been able to bring them down, but reaction time was very limited. The Shadok, as I said, was a big unit. It was 10 metres long and had a 5-metre wingspan, not that much smaller than a MiG-15. It was subsonic and it flew a straight course. Both Terrier and Talos had demonstrated an ability to hit such targets in Vietnam by downing a MiG-17 and 4 MiG-21s respectively. These, however, weren't Aegis systems. I believe I'm correct in saying that each ship only had one SAM director, so although they could launch multiple missiles, they could only engage one target at a time. If Grozny was 15 miles away, then flight time was about a minute and a half. There was, therefore, time to launch 3 or maybe 4 salvos of 2 Terriers, and probably 2 salvos of Talos in that time. Assuming that a cap was already aloft, it is not inconceivable that Phantoms could have chased down cruise missiles fired towards the carriers. An Israeli Mirage 3 shot down a Kelt missile on the first day of the war using a Shafir 2. The size of the Shaddocks suggests that the F-4s would have been able to use Sidewinders or the Big White Wingman for the same purpose. ECM and chaff had proved effective against the less powerful Sticks in engagements earlier in the Yom Kippur War, and would have also been part of the Navy's defensive strategy. In the reports that have come out in the last 20 years, there's a sense that the Soviet missiles would have doomed the US carriers. But as I stack up the defensive systems with the relatively small number of quite crude missiles being launched, I'm not so sure that's what would have happened. It's hard to make a case for any missiles reaching their targets. FDR's tale was centered around Murmansk, which was an old-school 6-inch gun cruiser. Warning would have been limited if that ship decided to engage, however there would have been some delay to correct the aim of the guns. Lee only had 2 3-inch guns, so it would have been dependent on the US destroyers to fight off the big cruiser until FDR could get out of range, launch aircraft, or both. The threat to FDR was arguably worse than that to Independence. The carrier commanders therefore needed to figure out how to launch their nuclear strikes, clear the deck, and get off some anti-ship sorties. Those would either carry dumb bombs or potentially laser-guided paveways. The US wouldn't deploy air-launched anti-ship missiles on the Intruder until the early 1980s. All of the Soviet ships carried SAM systems, although whether they would have had the wherewithal to use them effectively given everything else that was going on is hard to assess. Even so, despite this being an aviation channel, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the first minutes of a conflict between US carriers and the Soviet Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean in October 1973 would have been determined by the carriers' escorts. You can see why the option to launch a first strike may have been taken if the fleet commanders felt the slightest inkling of a threat. If they survived those first minutes, then the US carriers would have gone on the offensive to hunt down the other surface formations at large in the Mediterranean. That's how full-scale wars start. Fortunately, in this case, both sides backed down. Brezhnev and Nixon agreed that a UN force without US or Soviet representation would police the ceasefire. After a few weeks, both sides began to draw down their forces. So these scenarios remain simply interesting thought experiments.